Hey, everybody. Another great version of Tarter Sauce here at the Journal Star, Peoria Journal Star. I'm Steve Tarter. With me today, my guest, Rich Draeger. Rich, Development Director, Peoria Salvation Army. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. I've known Rich a long time, back in your radio days.
That's right.
Which we always like to think, we've returned to radio days here when you're doing a podcast. Rich, how long have you been at the Salvation Army?
Well, when I started there, they told me don't count years, count Christmases. So this is my 18th Christmas.
Coming up.
Coming up.
All right.
Yep.
Well, that's appropriate. I think most of us, this might be our first holiday show. We'll call it that. Because I see them putting Halloween decorations up in August in the stores, and certainly Christmas comes not long after. But no, Salvation Army is always equated with Christmas. How is that going? Is that still your big drive for the year?
Yeah, it certainly is. I think the challenge, obviously, when you live in the state that we live in, funding sources, kind of dry up or they're not as reliable. So one of our challenges, especially the last 5 or 6 years, is to let people know we're not just a Christmas charity. Certainly, we still kind of, lay claim to that. In a month or so, you won't be able to walk past the store in Central Illinois without hearing the bells ring. But we don't pop out of the ground in November and go back in January. If you come to our lunchroom in July, August, you're going to see 40, 50 people there every day eating lunch. Same in our overnight men's shelter. So we are a year-round organization that makes most of our money at Christmas time.
And we should mention, because you and I communicated recently about the homeless issue, that's a big issue that the Salvation Army has long been involved with, nationally, locally. How is that working out? Because I know, was it a couple of years ago you guys had a funding issue and had to switch things around a little bit? Can you bring us up to speed on that?
First of all, kudos on that story. I think, the continuum of care is doing a nice job. The coordinated entry is kind of the latest change there. So a couple of years ago, we had a federal Hud Grant, and we lost that. And that was for operating our day programming for the most part. We do the overnight shelter for homeless men, and then we had a day program. So when we lost that funding, we had to cut back on case management and other things, and really we were just able to get money from the city, the county, and United Way to kind of reopen it on a very scaled back version. So when that money came back around, the Dream Center got some of the money from United Way, and then some of the HUD grants have gone to the Southside Office of Concern because they have the built-in advantage of having the available units for people to move into, and that's kind of where funders are going away from just the emergency shelters, and they're going really more into the long-term,
more permanent,
housing. So that's kind of where that dynamic changed for us. But we still provide food for both the Southside Office of Concern, and we're providing meals for the Dream Center for their portion of that. So the continuum of care does a nice job of kind of getting all the agencies to play ball together, because
coordinate the thing.
No one agency can do it all. I mean, even when we did it, there were pieces that we really couldn't do as well as if we would parcel it out.
Well, and it seems fair, because it is a widespread problem, and I think one of the folks we were talking with in that article made the comment that it's a solvable problem. I know, obviously, you could say that about a lot of things, but that would seem to indicate, with enough funding and coordination, and maybe a little more affordable housing to allow people to move up from the shelter. Do you agree with that?
I think the affordable housing is really the key component. I know we do a Salvation Army Day down in Springfield where we go and visit our legislators. We don't lobby per se, but we just thank them for what they're doing. And we've had an audience with the governor the last couple of years, and it really does come down to the affordable housing, and then understanding when you pitch it to a donor, whether it's a foundation, a state entity, a grantor, that it's not as simple as just saying, okay, we're changing this model, let's move everybody into affordable housing, because that's the challenge. I know we work with anywhere between 150 to 170 landlords trying to get people affordable housing, and it's a transition that's going to take place. I think that's the ultimate goal. We'd like to not have people that don't have a place to go or have a place of their own. So that's really where the coordinated entry and kind of for the first time prioritizing, is this person somebody who can maybe get employed, has income, and can move into a permanent housing? Or are there people, and I think there are some people that have a variety of, whether it's mental health issues, drug and alcohol, that are going to be much more difficult to get into housing. So it's the process that's just starting now, and that's kind of the new wave, and we're happy to be a part of that.
And that it does, once you get into it, you realize it is complicated. It isn't sort of like, okay, everyone go on over here and you got a bed for the night, or you've got an apartment, because life's not that simple. And certainly, we've seen the issues with PHA trying to break up the Taft Homes thing. And wherever they go, they find resistance. So, I mean, there's that part of it, too.
And as your article pointed out, too, there were a couple of gentlemen that you talked to that said, we're only here right now, we're not happy with the situation, we want to move on. But one of them also said there are people that live on the street, and that's how they prefer to live. I know we've had folks come into our Veterans Center, for instance, that were homeless. And we would say, we really want to work to get you off the streets. And they're like, well, I don't really want to get off the streets. Whether they've had bad situations happen in the past, and they have money, they have subsidy checks or Social Security or even back military benefits, but they just don't feel comfortable being confined by that. So they can pick up and go whenever they want, but it adds to a lot of their difficulties when they don't have an opportunity to go in and seek help to try to address some of those underlying problems.
It's almost like, and this is a fanciful example, but you'll see an old movie, and this has been sort of a stereotype or something, and they always have the freight yard with the hobos gathered around the soup bowl or the kind of a cauldron, and then they all hop on the freight, and it's almost like life on the open road,
right.
Huzzah, and probably was not all that great. No. I know the Depression pushed some people into that.
Sure.
But well, now, Rich, what's a typical when you're, and I imagine there's not such a thing as a typical day, but when you're dealing with 4 counties, as you are, trying to develop the Salvation Army, what does that mean?
A lot of it is education. We have people that have been longtime supporters of ours, but when you take them on a tour of our downtown campus, if I don't hear the words, I don't know, at least 3 or 4 times, then I feel like I haven't done my job. We added a board member couple of years ago, and she was a principal of a grade school here in Peoria, and there are a lot of kids that are on free and reduced lunch. So you extrapolate that out and say she probably has students of people that we have served. Had no idea that we have a child care, and that we've had one since 1932, and that has run continuously since then. So we always joke, or at least I do sometimes, I'm not so sure the officers do, that the S's on their uniform stand for silently serving. They show up, they do the work, they don't worry about necessarily telling people this is what we're doing. So education is a big portion of it. Just the other evening, we had our annual dinner in Pekin, and so for that, I helped support it in terms of trying to just the basic setup. We help them with maybe getting tickets ready. They work on the venue. We work with advisory boards quite a bit, so kind of training up our advisory boards that we have. So really, each town is a little bit different. Canton is another area that I work with. They have a great young officer that's been there, Lieutenant Sarah Eddy, and we've worked with her on getting her board developed. She had 3 board members. When she came 18 months ago, she's now got it up to 9. So then you have the whole process of, okay, now that you have a board, how do you work with them? How do you do programs committee? How do you do a finance committee? So it really depends on where you're at. And then in Peoria is kind of the big dog of all of them. So a lot of that is fundraising, trying to identify what the needs are. So we have a program called Partners for Good, where we work with businesses to not just show up at Christmas time and say, hey, we need your financial support, but engage them throughout the year at their comfort level. So if they say, hey, I only want to see somebody from the Salvation Army once a quarter, that's what we do. But we engage them trying to offer them volunteer opportunities. So if they're looking for a corporate way to get their employees something to do in the community to help an agency, they can work with us. And then they can also help us offset costs if we can't get the money by providing in-kind services. So our feeding programs that we do, for instance, we have a couple of area restaurants, Michael's Italian Feast and some others, that help provide meals for us. Whereas if we had to provide the meals ourselves, number one, the quality would be less, and number two, it would cost us.
Sure.
So in that instance, all we have to do, we already have the building open and the people coming in, we just reach out to a restaurant and then they provide the food for us. So there's a variety of things. So I was going to answer you, if I run into a typical day, I'll let you know, because each day is really different.
Well, that says it. Now, you mentioned something about the difficulties being in Illinois with funding. We know about budget, and we deal with that every day, and it seems like it's been that way for years now. Is it particularly, and I'm thinking of the agencies, social agencies that have to help the poor, help people in need, and that's not going away. We always hear about greater needs. Is that highly competitive in the central Illinois area? It's probably everywhere, but
Sure.
When you look at it, how does that work? Do you guys have to? I mean, you mentioned the Continuum of Care, which is a group of agencies, yourself included. You come together, but you're also competing to some extent.
Right. I mean, I remember when I first got into the fundraising field, I mean, I started out kind of more on the PR side, but once I got into really more of the fundraising side, you know, my way of thinking, and this may be right or wrong, I'm not sure, is that even with board members, we may not always be their favorite charity or people that support us. So, for instance, we have honorary Christmas chairs each year. I remember we had the likes of Bruce Sowers and Pete Vanaken. Their #1 charity was always Children's Hospital. I said,
Right.
okay, so if we can't change your mind on that, we better be in your top 3. And so it does kind of evolve. And
Yeah.
especially with honorary chairs, this year we have Doug and Vicki Stewart. And they've helped a variety of nonprofits and charities. They led the United Way campaign to great success a few years ago.
Right.
So you constantly kind of have to jockey for position. And I think with an agency like ours, the Salvation Army, it's not that it's a forgotten population, but it is different. You know, I serve on the Children's Hospital Community Advisory Board. It's a little easier to say, gosh, what would it be like if we didn't have Children's Hospital here? What if your child got sick and had to go to Chicago or St. Louis? So it's a little more difficult for us. And I think what happens is when times get tough, everybody has to be more I guess, more intentional about spreading their story and telling their story, because I remember when my mom retired, she would, every time I'd go and see her, she'd have a handful of appeals from different agencies, and she says, how do I decide? And I said, well, really, Mom, you just have to decide what's on your heart and what's the most important, and then you'll see people every once in a while, we'll bounce up and somebody's giving one year, then maybe we bounce back down. So you have to constantly be working those people to make sure they have the right information and let them know what the return on their investment is financially with you.
And I know that's something that you know you have to work at, as you said, all year long. I mean,
yeah.
it isn't just here comes Christmas, so roll out that particular Christmas lights and all the things you guys do. Now, Rich, you started. I think when I first knew you, working on radio on WTAZ, which was out then in Morton.
Correct.
No longer. I think TAZ is now. What is that? It's retained the call letters,
Yeah.
but it's not in Morton. I think
No.
it's one of the somebody's station out there. Somebody will tell us. But what was your take going into radio? What was that like? Was that something you always wanted to do?
Well, my dad was in the Air Force. He was a radio operator, so I guess I kind of had that in the genes a little bit. But when I was growing up, certainly in high school, my first job actually was as a newspaper reporter. I covered sports, primarily for, at that time, it was the Tazewell News, I think. And so I covered high school sports. I had a sister who played basketball for Morton High School. They were very good back then in the late 70s and early 80s. So I kind of had the bug. I wanted to be the next Brent Musburger or whatever.
Right.
I wanted to do sports play-by-play. And then as I got a little bit older and went to Bradley, I was the basketball manager. So at that time, Bradley had 3 radio stations broadcasting. So the
Sure.
managers would split up, and I would take a coach to WIRL, somebody else would take one to WMBD, and somebody would take one to WXCL, I think was the 3rd station.
Yeah.
So I got to know all the play-by-play guys. That's where I first met Dave Snell and Scott Miller, who eventually became involved at WTAZ, and he actually hired me, and it was from my relationship with them. So I wanted to do that, but then after I got into the world and realized I didn't want to move here for 2 years, there for 2 years, and maybe get my shot, I decided, and because my family was here, to stay here in Peoria. But in a miniature way, I got to do it all. I got to do color commentary with Norm Ulrich on the Chiefs one summer. I got to do the pregame show for the Peoria Rivermen when we covered them in some very good years, and I got to meet a lot of those great guys from the old Rivermen teams. I got to do some TV. I did some Bradley women's basketball locally on WTVP. So I kind of got to do a little bit of everything that I wanted to do, just on a smaller scale. And it obviously helped me transitioning from the media then to my current job, because I had some great contacts in the media.
Plus, you know how to talk into a microphone.
Exactly.
You know, you mentioned that, and I think somebody might be, and I don't mean to pick on poor Bradley. They've had some tough years, the basketball program. But, yeah, back in the 80s, 3 different radio stations were doing simultaneously play-by-play. So you turn that dial, and you'd hear different guys doing Bradley basketball. I think Mort Cantor was still doing it,
Right.
Dave Snell certainly, and Who was the third one?
I don't remember who did it on WXL.
Yeah,
I know Scott Miller was on the broadcast, but I don't know that he was the play-by-play guy. And I actually then worked with Mort. Mort came over to WTAZ and had his own afternoon show, and he graciously allowed me to be called the producer, even though Mort did all of the producing himself. I got to turn the mics on and off and run the commercials, but he was a good mentor to me. I mean, we got to do some things. We carried the Cardinals in those days, so we went down and got, which I'm sure they wouldn't do now, Learfield Sports gave us some satellite time. So we went down there and did Mort's show from the old Cardinals football stadium locker room, which was just down the hall from the baseball locker room. So, I mean, I got to be in professional athletes' locker room and talk to pro players. So he was a good mentor to me, and, you know, he would kind of and I got to do other things with Mort. I worked with his East Peoria Vonnie softball team. So he really exposed me to a lot of good stuff. And Dave Snell I got to know, and he's still a good friend to this day. So
and still rolling. Yeah, Mort Cantor, you mentioned him, and I think I knew Mort a little bit, and probably not so much in his heyday, if that was his heyday, WIRL, when he was doing, when Bradley was, I don't know when Mort actually started. Maybe it was the 50s? I'm not sure, but I caught him, sort of later on when he was at TAZ. He had an afternoon talk show, and I know you're familiar with this, and I think he wanted guests, occasionally, and he called me up, and I don't remember why, but he said, I want to do something on old radio.
Oh, yeah.
Can you bring, and I brought Frank Thomas out to the station. Now, Frank Thomas, for people who don't know, was the Bradley station, the Bradley CBU station, the public radio station. He had a Sunday night show. He played all these old radio shows, and he was a big collector, and he had all these things. Of course, now you just turn on the internet.
Right.
And, turn on the internet? Is it ever off? No. But anyway, Frank was very knowledgeable, and I took him out there, and I played the role of kind of, okay, Mort, here's Frank, and I sit back, And Mort was so funny because it was my chance to see how he did that show, and Frank was kind of like public radio, kind of low key, and spoke like we're talking now, and were not Mort. Mort was screaming, yelling, jumping up and down, and I know at one point Frank was like, when we left, he said, I've never been through anything like that. It's like,
and he was like probably not caffeinated either. That was just the way Mort was.
That was Mort. And it was like old radio meets, modern radio or whatever it was, or public radio. But no, it was funny. But no, he was always interested in different things, and that's something that you can really. Well, I think that's why we have podcasts. I don't know. That's the way I am. What do you miss? When you listen to radio now, I assume you do.
I do,
because you're an old radio guy.
I'm a channel changer. It's kind of funny. I still get angry when I hear like missed commercial breaks. Especially when you carry.
You want to call the station.
You carry a network show, and they'll say we're going to pause 10 seconds for station identification, and it's probably some young high school kid, trying to get his break.
How about when
radio.
they play two together?
Exactly at the same time, and a lot of times with automated shows, they just send the tone down, and those kind of things drive me crazy. It is interesting though, even in all of media. You watch the evening news, and they use Facebook as a source for news. I mean, I was a radio news guy, and I didn't even like using the newspaper sometime. Certainly I would never do it without crediting the paper.
Bless your heart.
You just kind of lose those skills that, not like I'm an old fogey, but I'm in my mid-50s, and it's changed so much in the last 10 or 15 years. To me, sometimes, and this is not a condemnation of Facebook, but sometimes it's almost like hearsay. Well, somebody else said this or that. I'm like,
sure.
Do you realize that's somebody like on a message board or on Facebook or something?
We really don't know.
And they use it as a source. And, it's that has certainly changed. I actually do miss the fun part of it. I remember I was on radio at the height of the Caterpillar UAW stuff in the 80s. And I bowled in a bowling league with my brother, and I said, please call me Joe Draeger. That was my nickname in high school. I said, just say Joe Draeger. And one night I got a phone call, and they said, Rich Draeger, you have a telephone call. So I go up to the desk, and I answer the phone. I turn around, there's like 8 guys behind me. Hey, we want to talk to you about what you guys were talking about on the news this morning. And I always tried to be Mr. Neutral all the time, and not pick sides.
Good luck with that.
I was like, wow, that didn't work out too well. And then every week, then it was just every time, guys would come down a couple lanes. Hey, you guys, what did you think about this today? And what did you think about that today? But the neat thing about media was the people I got to meet.
Yeah.
We had G. Gordon Liddy on the air, and for somebody who grew up in the late 60s and early 70s to know about a real live Watergate criminal who I was sitting as close to as I am to you right now.
And a real wacko.
He was a strange dude, that's for sure. Mary Madeline and James Carville, Rush Limbaugh, some of those people that I got to meet, some of them on their way up, some of them on their way down, but just fascinating people. That's probably what I miss the most, especially being in kind of the news and the talk side, is you really got to rub elbows with people and see things kind of behind the scenes. So I kind of miss those. I actually never was a DJ. When I applied at WTAZ, they still played music. Wayne R. Miller was there.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was going to be, I was going to be a DJ, and I have probably still have some horrible mixtapes that I would send to radio stations.
We'll have to play those next time you come on.
To dust them off and find a cassette player, I guess.
We'll find one. Did it surprise you that talk radio took off? Because I think you were at TAZ, and TAZ, I mean, I know it was going on elsewhere around the country, but if we want to say how it plays in Peoria and how they're always using this town as sort of the, litmus test for the United States, talk kind of came on at WTAZ. I mean, I think always talk radio shows, but the whole format.
I think we were one of the first FM talk stations in the country, and I remember when Rush Limbaugh started. Owen Spann, ABC Talk Radio, all of the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, all had a radio arm, and they all had talk shows. And we carried a lot of the ABC Talk Radio. So there was a gentleman named Owen Spann, I think he was from San Francisco, and just up and quit. So we get noticed like on a Wednesday. By the way, Friday's his last day, so we now have a 2-hour hole to fill. At that time, Rush Limbaugh was only 2 hours. We have a 2-hour hole to fill, and we're like, okay, what are you going to do? We don't have any alternative program for 2 hours. And they said, well, we got this guy. He's working at a station in Sacramento. We're going to give him a shot. And I remember, because I was working that day, we flipped that switch to hit, at that time he was affiliated with ABC, and Rush Limbaugh came on, and now he's still on the air 30-some years later.
So you're responsible.
No, I'm not responsible. They made me do it. They made me flip the switch. But I think it is fascinating to see. And now, now talk radio is everywhere. Sports talk, news talk. All the cable channels. And when you throw in Sirius, there are people on radio nowadays that never would have had a voice before, literally, and now they just have so many opportunities.
I'm wondering how that's going to work. I don't know that it's going to be on for a long time or not, but they just launched another sports talk, Sports Nut.
Oh, yeah. Here
95.9. It's very close to 96.5 ESPN, two different stations, both doing sports talk. Now, I think they both play, I don't know what, I know ESPN plays Cubs,
right,
and probably U of I and some other things. But you got to wonder, because I think there's a market for that, but my guess is the demographic for that is male, probably middle age or whatever it is, and you really need two banging at it, or maybe winner takes all. I don't know how that works.
And ironically, I know one of your previous guests here was Doc Watson.
Yeah,
neither one of them do high school sports, but Doc Watson does that on 95.5. So,
that's right.
And that was always, that was something I did. We did high school sports, and it was really difficult to try to figure out. And again, in those days, you had two or three. You had the Dave Murphys of the world, and you had Doc doing it. And, 96.5 did do some high school sports when Doc was there, and then it's just kind of moved around. And that's kind of the struggle for Peoria. They have a lot of small town aspects to it,
right,
but they still want to be a little more big time. And the high school sports is something that's really kind of small town, nostalgic.
And of course, we have some very successful high school teams throughout the area. You mentioned Dave Murphy. There's a character, because Dave Murphy, if people who don't know, did sports for, I think you could recite the stations.
Oh, yeah.
But the last time I ran into Dave, driving a bus.
Right, for
because he
Peoria
would drive a Peoria Charter coach. And it was, I think we went to the farm show over by Decatur when we were covering that a couple of years ago. And, it was funny. It was like old home week. And there's Dave up there. And, of course, he's talking about, I would still be doing it, but, and, had all that stuff going on. But
I would still be doing it, but I found out it doesn't pay very well.
Well, I think Dave would sell advertising, do the show, line up this, print up a flyer. He was a one-man gang.
He was.
Well, very good. Well, Rich Draeger, you've been our guest here on Tarter Sauce. We can get into radio. We can get into the many things Salvation Army. I'd love to have you come back and maybe give us, I know it's not the only time the Salvation Army's around, but we could talk a little more about the bells and Santa and that whole business, because, I think that's a side of Christmas that we need to focus on along with the gifts and the
Sure.
and the retail and
Yeah.
all the things we write about madly in
Absolutely.
the paper.
Well, we'd love to come back. We're really looking forward to this year's Christmas efforts. Doug and Vicki Stewart have already, I think I've been on the phone more with them the first couple of weeks that we've been talking with them than I was probably my last.
Well, he's
3 or
retired
4.
now, right? So
that's right. He's got
got
of
more
free
time. Yeah.
He does have a new grandchild, but other than that, he's got a lot of free time, and Vicki keeps us on our toes.
Very good. All right. Well, thanks again, Rich. And folks, want to thank Matt Dayhoff at the controls, and we'll see you next time.